Good afternoon. I'm Laura Polari-Welvis. I'm Director of Encore Learning. I'm delighted to be with you here today for Encore Learning Presents Stumbling Stones, Memorializing Arlington's Enslaved People. And I'm joined today by our special events volunteer and Jessica Kaplan from Arlington Historical Society. Before we get started, just a couple of ground rules. We'll have a presentation and with questions being answered at the end of the presentation. So after about an hour, questions will be answered. These questions should be put in the Q&A module. It's just a button down at the bottom of your Zoom, Q&A. We do not answer anything on the chat. So put your questions there. Following the event, there will be a survey. So do click on that link and complete the survey that's in SurveyMonkey. We find the feedback really helpful to share with our presenters. If you would like the live transcript, you can enable that. That's the closed captions, and that's a setting you can turn on your own device. Just a couple things about upcoming events. Next Monday, 1 week from today, we have a presentation on called Trusted Source, How a Virginia Nonprofit Defied Polarization. This is featuring David Poole from the VPAP, and we're delighted to have him here next Monday. And then on Monday, October 27th, we've got a fantastic program with an open house at 2 o'clock and a presentation at 3 o'clock. This is going to be at George Mason University at their new Fuse building. So you'll get to see the new building. I was just there last week for the groundbreaking or the ribbon cutting, and it was a great event. So we're looking forward to this event. Put it in your calendar, sign up. It's an in-person event. We have several upcoming tours. Watch your Encore Learning emails to see what's coming up. And I'd now welcome Kathy McCormick, our special events volunteer, to introduce our speaker today.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you're all here. We're up to about 56 people, so that's great. So I'd like to introduce Miss Jessica Kaplan. Jessica is a retired archivist and has been a freelance historical researcher for more than 20 years. She has served on the board of directors of the Arlington Historical Society for 8 years and is currently the editor of the Arlington Historical magazine. Jessica co-directs the project called Memorializing the Enslaved in Arlington in partnership with the Black Heritage Museum of Arlington. She is also a master gardener and has headed up research on methods used by colonial Virginians in their kitchen gardens. A longtime resident of Arlington, Jessica has researched and written about Arlington history for the Arlington Historical magazine, including articles such as The Bottom, an African-American Enclave Rediscovered, and I Was a Union Man, James and Lewis Marcy's Civil War Experience. And thirdly, People of the Book, Jewish Arlington, 1900 to 1940. And the fourth article is Employed to Advantage, Hiring an Enslaved and the Enslaved People of Arlington. So lots of historical research in Jessica's background. Put your questions into Q&A, and I'm watching it very carefully. And when she's finished speaking, we will convey the questions to her, and she'll give us the answer. Enjoy the program. Thank you. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you. Let me get... There we go. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak this afternoon about my important project, Memorializing the Enslaved in Arlington. It reveals the untold story of enslavement in Arlington and commemorates the struggles and contributions of the once enslaved population here. The project started about 4 years ago when a man named Tim Aiken, an Arlingtonian, came to the Historical Society with an idea. It was one that he had gotten from an article written by Michelle Norris, who's a journalist. She's with NPR and the Washington Post. She was. And she had spent some time in Germany and had seen the powerful impact of something called Stolperstein, or stumbling stones, to commemorate Holocaust victims. And she felt that they would be an excellent way to commemorate the contributions of the enslaved people in the United States. Tim thought it was fabulous. When he brought the idea to the Historical Society, I instantly jumped on board. The two of us then sought out Scott Taylor at the Black Heritage Museum, who was excited to also come on board. And that's sort of the genesis of the project. Since its inception, there's been a lot of research into the lives of enslaved in Arlington that's gone on in our project. But it's become much more than just a research undertaking. It grapples with a painful era in Arlington and America's past, and it compels us to remember, as Washington Post reporter Petula Dvorak wrote. She did a little piece on our project. Of all that enslaved Arlingtonians compels us to remember all that enslaved Arlingtonians gave to us and all that was taken. So slavery is a difficult topic. You know, we can't change the ugly truth that it occurred here. We can try to hide it, but it won't really work. Um, but something we can do is to make sure that we honor the struggles and contributions of thousands of enslaved Arlingtonians by telling their stories and celebrating their resilience. A descendant of Caroline Branham, who was enslaved at both Mount Vernon and then Arlington House, told me in an interview last week, if we try to erase that history, there's no understanding of whence we all came. Since memorializing the enslaved began, I have worked with a team of researchers, and we have together scoured through many, many, many documents. As a matter of fact, we counted them up, and we've looked through 280 primary and secondary sources. And that's to learn about enslavement and those enslaved in Arlington. And on this slide is a list of just some of the different kinds of documents that we looked at. And I've put probate records at the top, which of course are records created when someone passes away, wills, accounts, inventories, because that's where we found the most information on enslaved people's lives. We found out their names, their family relationships, often their ages. It was a really, really fruitful resource. With the data that we collected from all of the records we looked through, me and our team of volunteers were able to put together a timeline of slavery, which provides important historical context, a database of enslaved individuals, and I really hope that all of you go to our website, the enslavedarl.org, to look at this, because you can look for people by location, by names, by who their enslaver was. You can find family relationships and different status in their lives. It's a really fabulous resource. We've also put together stories of enslaved people where the records were really fruitful. We were able to follow people often from slavery to freedom. And some of these stories are truly amazing. So I urge you to look at them. There are more academic type articles you can find on local enslavement. There is an interactive map of locations of enslavement, and there is a walking tour of Columbia Pike that you could all take if you're interested in seeing where enslavement happened along the Pike. And that happens to be where there were many, many different farms and plantations. So check it out. Here are some of the main research findings from our 4 years of scouring the records. Arlington, in both the 18th and 19th century, was very rural and sparsely populated. Up until 1800, a full third of the population was enslaved. That's a pretty large number. We have found over 2,700 enslaved people but only the names of about 1,145 of those individuals. We found 463 enslavers. They didn't all live in Arlington, but they lived in this region. So we were able to track slaves that had lived in Arlington and maybe were sold to the Washington, D.C. or to Loudoun County. So this area was fairly porous back then. There are around 170 locations of enslavement. The majority of them were operated by small-time enslavers who held maybe 1 to 5 individuals on their farms. But the vast amount were held by a small number of large plantation owners. The largest plantations, you can see them on the right here, are Arlington House, Abington, and Glebe House. Arlington House by far was the largest. There were over 235 people that we found enslaved there, and I think that we are missing some of them. It was a vast plantation of over 1,100, well, roughly 1,100 acres. The final finding is that by 1850, almost half of all the enslavers were hiring out their slaves. And this sort of kept slavery going at a time when the numbers of enslaved people were actually falling. So before I get into the details of our research, I'd like to focus on a really disturbing underlying fact of slavery. And that is, by law, enslaved people were property, not people. And if you look on the left, I have an inventory of a man named William Hardin who died in 1781. And he's got a list of some of his property here, and it starts with Negroes. And he actually names some of them, which it was rare. But the excitement of finding names dissipated quickly when I saw that he had listed them by horses, cattle, and sheep, which was par for the course. To the right, I have what's called a slave schedule, and it was part of the US Census only in 1850 and 1860. And it is a separate listing of individuals who were enslavers and the people whom they enslaved. And you can see on the left are the names of the slave owners. So we have Richard Williams, if you go to the far column, Randolph Birch, William R. Birch, Basil Hall. There are no names for the enslaved people here. All we have are an age and a gender. And for anyone trying to find relatives who were enslaved, this is a brick wall in which it's hard to get past when there are no names to look at to find one's ancestors. So in 1669, a man named Robert Hyson patented the northern neck of Virginia, which included much of what is now Arlington County. In order to get the patent, he had to bring 120 settlers to the region, which was then Stafford County. And amongst them were 10 Negroids. And this was the first mention of enslavement in the area. Arlington went through many, many historical changes over its lifetime. And this chart below talks about when Arlington was part of Stafford, Prince William. It was part of Fairfax County for most of the 18th century. In 1801, it became part of the District of Columbia. And it was retroceded back to Virginia in 1847 and was part of Alexandria County. And it wasn't until 1920 that it actually became Arlington County. But for today's purposes, I am just going to say Arlington and know that it might have been a different government jurisdiction, but we're talking about the space that is Arlington as we know it today. By 1700, there were a number of absentee landowners that owned most of what is now Arlington, and a lot of them had small-time tenants that rented the land from them. All of them used, not all of them, most of them used enslaved laborers like Con, Charles, Sarah, and Killimachi in tobacco cultivation, which was what the local economy was based on. Tobacco was king. It was the main crop, and our currency was based on it. To grow tobacco, though, took extremely heavy and labor-intensive work, and many hands were needed to grow it. Um, at this time in Arlington history, there was a lot of virgin forest. The enslaved would have to cut down the virgin forest, stump all the trees, uh, plow, amend the soil to make it useful for growing tobacco, plant the seeds, thin the seeds, weed and pull off cutworms and ringworms, which were bountiful, before they got their tobacco leaves, which they then had to harvest and dry and then prepare for export. So, like I said, extremely labor intensive. So the oldest plantation in Arlington that continuously ran as a place of enslavement was Abingdon. And on the map on the left, I have it circled, and you can see that Gerard Alexander was the owner in 1760. And there's a number beneath his name, 24, meaning he enslaved 24 people. Where his plantation was is exactly where National Airport sits today. On the upper right, you can see there's an illustration of what Abington looked like in the 19th century and a picture of the foundations of Abington, which exist, if you're interested, between, I believe, parking lot A and B at the airport. So if if you ever have a long wait for a flight, maybe that's something interesting you can do with your families. In 1878, the Alexander heirs sold Abington to John Parke Custis, and he was the step-grandson of George Washington and the real son of Martha Washington. He and his wife moved to Abington with over 60 enslaved individuals, ran it as a plantation, and as a very elegant plantation home. They had a lot of domestic servants who prepared elegant meals for the Washington family and for other illustrious visitors that they often received. The Wise family rented the house for 20 years in the early 1900s. And in the 1830s, the sheriff of DC, Alexander Hunter, bought the plantation. He lived there for 10 years, enslaving many, many people. And when he died in 1849, he bequeathed it to his nephew, also named Alexander Hunter. He was a miner, and so Alexander's brother, his name was Bushrod Hunter, took over management of Abington. He also enslaved many, many people. And what's really cool is that his son, Alexander, was an author. And in the 1860s on, he wrote a couple of books in which he talked about his life at Abington. So if you ever look at Billy Yank and Johnny Reb, that was written by Alexander Hunter. His other book is Huntsman of the South. Um, so if you're interested in some interesting anecdotes on enslaved life, those are two good sources to look at. In addition to selling tobacco, enslaved people were involved in a lot of domestic service tasks. And they're written here down on the side. You know, we think of preparing and serving food and cleaning the manor house as probably the two biggest uh, chores that were undertaken, probably childcare as well. But there were so many more duties linked to domestic service, like candle and soap making, cloth production, processing foods, and dairying. So any enslaved person who was in the manor house would be involved in some of these tasks. On the left is a shot of a plantation called Tortherwald, which was located in what's now Fairlington, over by Abington Elementary School. And it was the second home of John Carlyle. His first home was in Alexandria City. He was a very wealthy man, and he used the second home to breed cattle, um, for farming, but also for milling wheat and corn. He kept a large domestic staff because he had weavers and smiths, and he had cows that needed to be milked, and of course, a very genteel home that needed to be looked after. In Carlisle's inventory, we saw that he enslaved 43 people at the time of his death at Tortherwald. So, enslaved servants who were involved in domestic service, there were many, especially at Arlington House. And two of them were Ariana Carter and her daughter, Mariah Carter Syphax. Uh, they came to, Ariana came to Arlington House from Mount Vernon, and she was there when it was built in 1803 by George Washington Parke Custis's enslaved people. Custis was the step grandson of George Washington and the real life grandson of Martha Washington. Um, Ariana had a relationship with George Washington Parke Custis, and the result was Maria Carter Syphax. Um, and I like to tell this story because being in domestic service, particularly, made enslaved women especially susceptible to sexual exploitation. Uh, Custis was actually had a reputation as a philanderer, and Maria is probably the best known example of his proclivities. Mariah, it's actually Mariah. I keep saying Maria, but it's Mariah. She grew up at Arlington House and, believe it or not, worked as the personal servant to her white half sister, Mary Custis. She married a man named Charles Syphax, and he was a dining room servant at Arlington House. They had two children together when George Washington Parke Custis sold Mariah to a Quaker family in Alexandria, the Stabler family. And he did this as a way to actually free Mariah without having to do it himself. So Mariah and her two children were freed. And in 1845, Custis gave her 17 acres of land in the southwest corner of Arlington Estate. This is a map of the Arlington Estate here in the center, but you can't quite see, if you go down to the left, that would be where her land was. Mariah and Charles had 8 more children over the years. And because the status of enslaved children passed through the mother, and Mariah was at this point a free woman, all of her children were born free, which was really lucky for them. But strangely, Custis kept Charles Syphax enslaved up until 1862. And that's when all of the enslaved people at Arlington House were freed. Mariah died in 1886. And I don't know if a lot of you know about the Syphax family, but they were a very prominent a Black Arlington family in both the late 19th century and actually still today. I'd like to tell the story of Ariana and Mariah because it wasn't rare. Sexual exploitation created tangled and traumatic situations that enslaved women encountered throughout Arlington and beyond. Black women were forced to bear enslavers' children. Children enslaved by their white fathers had to remain in their households. Often, like in the case of Mariah, um, children were free when a father was still enslaved and had to watch his family from afar. Often, siblings of different legal status were living together under the same roof. I also feel for the white wives who faced a daunting situation, like Mary Custis. They were forced to live with their husbands philandering. The women that they abused, they were forced to live with, and the children from these relationships. Plantation life could be a hot mess. As the 18th century waned, farmers started turning away from tobacco cultivation to something called mixed farming. Mixed farming relied more on crop diversification. It was better for the soil because tobacco leached all the nutrients from soil. Mixed farming was based with growing grains and corn, vegetables, and orchards, lots of different fruits. Animal husbandry was involved. And when the weather was bad, farm maintenance became an important part. People would be involved in constructing and mending projects. Um, the kind of labor needed for mixed farming was not as heavy as what was needed for tobacco. So in the end, fewer hands were actually needed as we came into the 19th century. But if you were an enslaver, you had too many hands, but you still had the expenses of caring for these hands. So what to do with the surplus enslaved people that now were on all these plantations and farms? There were basically three choices. One could hire out the excess enslaved people to neighbors. One could actually free these enslaved people, which I don't think became very popular. Um, but this third option, selling their enslaved people to the Deep South, to cotton and sugar plantations, where more slave hands were needed, did become extremely popular. And slave traders who became very populous in this region exploited this third option. And over the years, began what was be called the domestic slave trade. I think of this as one of the most awful periods in the slave holding era. Um, Over 1 million excess enslaved hands were sold from the Upper South, and that included Arlington, and transported in the holds of ships or in coffles, like you see in the picture on the right, chained to one another to the Deep South by these trading firms. Franklin and Armfield in Alexandria City was probably the most successful trading firm in the area. They made a killing and they actually turned the slave trade into big business and modernized the entire profession. On the left, you see an account of a man named Joseph Birch who died in the early 1830s. And in order to care for his children, his estate heirs decided to sell one of his enslaved men, Loomis or Lewis, it's hard to read there, to Franklin and Armfield to be sent south. Um, so this was for the upkeep of his living children. The the slave trade was brutal upon enslaved families in Arlington and beyond. It tore them apart. A lot of the younger members of the families who were strong were the ones bought and sold south. There was a fear amongst people left in the area that if their enslaver died, that they might be the next ones sold south or that their family would be torn apart. It was very, very sad and difficult situation. Now I'm going to talk about Margaret Smith Hyson, who was directly affected by the slave trade. Margaret was born in 1825. She was the enslaved cook of a man named William Minor and his wife Catherine, and they lived near what is now Yorktown High School. William Minor, when he died, enslaved 29 individuals. When Margaret was in her 20s, she met a man named Jacob Powell, who lived on a neighboring plantation, and married him with the permission of their enslavers. A year later, right around 1848, she gave birth to a daughter named Mary. But in 1849, tragedy struck because Mr. Slade, Powell's enslaver, met with financial ruin, and he decided to sell Jacob south, dividing Margaret and her husband and their child. So I learned this story from a memoir of a woman named Catherine Williamson Malore, and she was the granddaughter of William Minor. And she wrote an incredible memoir that talked about antebellum life in Arlington. And luckily, I got my hands on it. And Malore wrote, my mother said that Jacob and Peggy, which they like to call Margaret Peggy, that their grief was heartbreaking. She also related that Peggy was very shrewd in her second matrimonial venture. She refused to marry any but a free-born man. So she was too worried that if she married someone enslaved, that they too might be sold south. She married a man named Thornton Hyson, and he lived near near the Minor plantation. And together they had 7 children. And like I said before, the status of the children ran through the mother's line. So all of these children were enslaved by the Minor family. So there's a free father, Thornton, having to watch his children grow up in enslavement while he was free. And I think that would be a very difficult situation. So I believe that Margaret was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, and she and Thornton lived on Hall's Hill, where she spent her entire life. And you can see that she's buried also on Hall's Hill at Callaway, in the Callaway Church Cemetery. On the left is a stumbling stone that was put down in March of last year that honors the life of Margaret Hyson. And the stone is at the corner of North Harrison Street and Little Falls Road. And we'll talk about it a little bit more later. I'd like to talk about another man, Henry Speaks, and he was enslaved by owners who refused to sell him south. Instead, they chose to hire him out. Henry was born in 1827 to a woman named Letty, and they were both enslaved by a man named Simon Summers. And that you can see I've circled the Summers farm, which is the middle farm. And it's near Westover. It's actually bounded by Langston Boulevard and Washington, almost down to Washington Boulevard. Simon died in 1836, and he bequeathed the Speaks to his daughter, Eliza. She manumitted Letty, but kept Henry enslaved. But when she died in 1848, she freed Henry, but there's always a but he had to be enslaved until he was 35, and then he would gain his freedom. In her will, she forbid her heirs from selling any of her enslaved people out of the Arlington and Virginia area. So Henry luckily remained nearby. Soon after Eliza's death, the Summer heirs sold Henry to Major Nutt, and you can see Major Nutt lived a little bit southwest of the Summers farm, probably not even a mile away. Um, and he used Henry for field work. After a few years, he hired out Henry to another local farmer, Richard Southern, and he's on the top right of the slide. And Richard Southern lived near what is now St. Anne's Church and is even buried behind it, if you've ever seen the Shreve Southern Cemetery there. And again, Henry worked as a field hand. This takes us up to the Civil War, and the Southern family fled to DC during the early years of the war because Union troops pretty much invaded the Arlington area. And when they went to DC, they took Henry with them. And this kind of worked against them in the long run because in 1862, the District of Columbia passed the DC Compensated Emancipation Act, which freed all the enslaved people in the district, and it freed Speaks. Incredibly, the enslavers were compensated for their loss, and the enslaved were not. In the petitions for the compensation records, there's a little like anecdotal information about Henry. He was listed as an able-bodied farmhand, jet black, medium-sized. He was a valuable farmer and gardener with no disease or infirmity. In 1863, our researchers were able to find that Henry lived in the District of Columbia and was working as a laborer. In 1875, we found him on a DC directory, and he was working as a driver. So he seems to have done fairly well when he made his transition from slavery to freedom. After 1875, he disappears from the records. Enslaved families who remained in Arlington, like Henry Speaks, they were often sold to locals, but at the same time, they were sold and they were separated from their families. And it was pretty common that these men and women would leave their farms periodically and go to visit their family, um, their loved ones who they wanted to stay in touch with. And they would do this with or without the permission of their enslavers. And we know about this because we found what's called runaway ads in the local papers, the Alexandria Gazette and the Daily National Intelligencer. So if you look at the bottom left of the screen, you see that two young girls, Rebecca and Sarah, who were sisters, and we get a great description of them. They ran away from the Summers residence to see their mother, Maria Simpson, who lived in Washington City. Above that runaway ad is another one in which John, who was enslaved to John Young, and John Young lived on Columbia Pike near Glebe Road, but he also had a house in the District of Columbia. And clearly, John had a wife living in the district, and he left John's Alexandria farm and went to visit her. And John put out this ad so that either the sheriff or local officials would collect him and bring him home. On the top right is a really interesting article by a man named Wesley Norris. And he was enslaved first by George Washington Parke Custis at Arlington House. And when Custis died, his son-in-law, Robert E. Lee, yes, that Robert E. Lee. After Custis died, a lot of the enslaved people at Arlington House felt that they had been promised freedom by Custis and that Lee was keeping them illegally. Wesley and his sister decided to take matters into their own hands and fled from Arlington Estate in the early 1860s. Robert E. Lee sent the sheriff after them, and he was able to find them before they reached Pennsylvania, where they were headed, and brought them back to Arlington House. In this article, Wesley Norris talks about the fact that Lee had the sheriff give him 50 lashes and his sister 20 lashes, and that it was fairly brutal, and that Robert E. Lee had the sheriff rub brine into their wounds. So a lot of brutality on the part of Robert E. Lee. After the beating, both Wesley and his sister were hired out, Wesley to a railroad in Tennessee and his sister to Southern Virginia. And finally, on this page, I have a record from the DC jail that lists, the second listing is for a man named George Singleton. And he was enslaved by a man named Columbus Alexander. And it turns out that Singleton ran away from Alexander and was captured by the sheriff and put in jail. And it looks like he spent 142 days in the DC jail, probably around 25 cents a day. And he was then finally collected by his enslaver. So prison records were another way to find out about those that ran away from their place of enslavement. Now I'm going to tell you a great story about a woman named Julia Roberts. She sued for her freedom. You had people every day resisting enslavement. They were feigning illness or just creating slowdowns. And like we just heard, some of them were running away to see their loved ones or to seek freedom. Julia chose to resist by the court system. Her story's courageous and it's fabulous, but I'm going to give you the abbreviated version or we could be here all afternoon. So we have to go back in time to learn the history of it. In 1801, Simon Summers, once again, we have the Summers family. They were quite large enslavers in Arlington. He owned Julia's mother and wrote a deed in which he manumitted Julia's mother, Sarah, when not immediately, but in 1814. And he said in his deed that if Sarah had any children before her freedom, that they would be enslaved until the age of 25. So, unfortunately for Julia, she was born around 1812, before Sarah's freedom, so that she would have to wait till she was 25, which was 1837, to gain her freedom. Julia was given to Simon Summers' daughter and son-in-law, that was Austin Adams, and they in turn hired her out to a farmer in Fairfax County. She spent many years in Fairfax County, but then was returned to the Adams. And we don't really hear from her until 1842, when I think Julia had decided she'd had enough, and decided to sue the Adams family for her freedom. Remember, in 1837, she was due to be freed, but she stewed on it until 1842, when she went to the Alexandria County Court, which was then part of the District of Columbia, and put in papers to sue for her freedom. The court granted her two lawyers, a father and son, the Brents, and it turned out they were excellent lawyers. I'm not going to go into the details of the case because, like I said, we'll be here quite a long time. But I want to just say that Julia, an enslaved woman, had the backbone to enter the white legal system and expect justice. And miraculously, she received it. If you look at the beige document, it is the verdict of the jury in her case. And it, of course, reads, "We, the jury, find for the petitioner," who was Julia Roberts. Well, that wasn't the end. Her enslavers, the Adamses, decided that they were going to appeal the decision, and they appealed they appealed it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And luckily for Julia, the Supreme Court affirmed her freedom. Julia's case was one of 6 freedom suits that made its way to the Supreme Court. And I'm sure she was incredibly joyous when she learned that she would leave the court a free woman. Below the picture of the enslaved woman is a notice from the Free Black Register, which is a description of Julia Roberts. Anyone who was any former enslaved person or free Black who was born that way had to register themselves with the court system so that the government could keep tabs on them. So that's her registration in 1845. Julia settled in Georgetown and worked as a maid, and she slowly just disappeared from the records after the 1840s. If you want to learn more about Julia's story, there's a fantastic article that's going to come out in the Arlington Historical Magazine about her case. That's coming out the end of October. And there's also going to be a play that's going to come out in the spring about the courtroom drama. I think it'll be wonderful. Well, the end of enslavement came to Arlington with the Civil War. On the top left is a picture of Arlington House, and it's hard to see, but there are lots of Union soldiers sitting on the portico of Arlington House. In 1861, in May, the Union troops walked over Long Bridge and occupied the heights of Arlington, including Arlington House. When they remained there throughout the war and eventually started building Arlington National Cemetery on the grounds of Arlington House. The middle picture is of an enslaved person who fled behind Union lines when the troops came in. This was extremely common. They just decided to self-emancipate. Some of them, even by 1864, joined the U.S. colored troops, as the man at the bottom of that photograph. On the top right is a picture of a Union soldier reading the Emancipation Proclamation to local enslaved people. This was passed on January 1st, 1863. Actually, it wasn't passed then, but that's when it was instituted. So by the beginning of 1863, most of Arlington's enslaved people were freed. The bottom left is a picture of former enslaved people coming to the DC area. People escaping from their enslavers swarmed to DC during the Civil War. And a lot of them lived in DC. And unfortunately, a lot of disease, these were very poor people, and disease came to where they were living. So the Union Army decided to set up what was called Freedmen's Village, and that picture is on the right, which is on the grounds of Arlington House, to house and feed and provide jobs for some of these former enslaved people. Freedmen's House became much more than just a contraband village. It was a place where the former enslaved learned skills that would make them self-sufficient. They learned carpentry skills. They went to schools to learn to read and write. They built churches. They had all sorts of organizations and societies to help them build lives as free people. Probably one of the most important places for in the 19th century Arlington, and a fabulous picture of it right here. I like to say that there was no handbook on becoming a free person. So it was very difficult to go from enslavement to freedom. especially since there was, no 40 acres and a mule. But the freed people persevered and, slowly made rich lives for themselves. Now I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to talk about memorializing the enslaved stumbling stones. So we've chosen to honor Arlington's once enslaved people by placing these round 6-inch brown markers, they're bronze, into Arlington's sidewalks at the locations of enslavement of these different people. And as I alluded to before, these are based on what's called Stolperstein or stumbling stones that honor Holocaust victims in Europe. I have pictures of 3 sets of stones. On the bottom left is Amsterdam, where the Anne Frank family has stones in front of their home. There are stones all over Rome, and of course, in sidewalks throughout Germany, and in this case, Berlin. So it's become a very, very powerful and important way to recognize the brutality against European citizens during the Holocaust, especially the Jews. Now, stumbling stone might seem like uh, a poor name for these stones because, of course, we don't want people tripping over them and hurting themselves. But people are meant to mentally stumble over them. Um, they're small monuments that we want people to stop at, to bow down and look at, um, as ways to connect the past to the present, and to make them think about where they live and where they're walking in a wholly new light. We also believe that they're very powerful educational tools.
Jessica, may I just give you your 10-minute warning?
Yes, absolutely. That's going to be perfect. Um, our stones on the right, you can see they're being placed by the Department of Environmental Services. Each stone has the name of an enslaved person, says once enslaved here on it, and whatever vital information we could find on that person. In 2024, the Historical Society and the county came to an agreement on placing the stones in sidewalks. The county agreed that the Department of Environmental Services would actually install them, and that they would help with the permitting process, and that the county would review their placement. And AHS would own the plaques, and that they would be an interface with the public to let them know about our project. Something else the county is doing is putting together an online map of all the different locations of where stones have gone down, and I've linked to that on our website. So that's a very cool thing to go look at. So to date, our project has put down 17 stones throughout Arlington, and these are some of the locations where they're down. Number 4, Green Valley, hasn't gone down yet, but hopefully November 9th, we're going to see them placed in front of Lomax AME Church. This fall, we have 5 to 7 more sites where stones are going to be placed. And in the spring, we have equally as many sites. An exciting thing we're doing with our stones is offering sponsorship options to the public, individuals, groups, churches, to help offset the cost of the stones if one's interested. Unfortunately, when the project started, grants were plentiful, but now NEH funding has been cut, which is definitely making a difference in funding. So we've also got tariffs that are increasing the cost of metal. So difficult times, but we are going to persevere. We have partnered with Arlington Public Schools with creating stones, and it's been a really wonderful connection. We've worked with what's called a CNC machining class, which is basically coding the engraving process. with an Arlington Tech teacher, Jordan Kivitz, and they created our first 17 stones. Really fabulous. We have a shop class at Kenmore Middle School, which is creating wooden replicas of our stones. And they put together a traveling exhibit of these stones that was actually at the public library this summer. We are putting together dedications, and some of them are at APS schools. The bottom left, you have students looking at stones that went in near Oak Ridge Elementary School. Uh, we have Superintendent Duran, who spoke to all the fourth and fifth graders about the importance of the stones and the history behind them. We also have lesson plans that are being about enslavement that are being taught in the schools. And finally, my favorite part, those are the dedications. Every stone that goes down has a dedication. And these are basically unveilings, formal unveilings of the stones um, that brings together our community in remembrance and in celebration. A lot of the attendees are descendants or neighbors, politicians, volunteers, students, and a lot of interested Arlingtonians. The stories of all the enslaved people being honored are told in depth, and we then remove uh, the cloth that's uh, hiding the stones and welcome them to the world in celebration. So they're really wonderful, and I hope some of you can join us this fall at dedications on our website. There's a listing. There will be listings of when they're going to be. And finally, I'd like to end with this quote that I think kind of gets to the heart of what our project is capturing. And I'll just read it out loud. And it's something that Superintendent Duran said to the Oak Ridge students that it made me cry at the time. These stones call on every one of us to take action to ensure that there's never a human being who's denied their humanity, that there's never anyone who doesn't have the right to go to school and be educated and choose and dream to be whatever they want to be. I'm going to call on you and expect each of you to make our world a better place. So thank you all for joining me today, for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. And thank you, Encore, for hosting me.
What a pleasure it is to hear the stories, Jessica. Thank you so much. Um, the last slide here shows up the website that we all want to look at here, and enslavedarl.org. So there's 5 questions right now, and the first one is a bit about semantics, a stepson being a real son or not, but I think we can probably agree that a stepson would be a real son. And the second one is, why were runaway girls, Rebecca and Sarah, called yellow girls? Brad would like to know about that.
Yellow complexion was a very light complexion that was almost to the yellow.
Okay, helpful. Stephen would like to know, would it have been common for a child of an enslaver born to an enslaved woman to know her or his father was their owner? Does this prompt you to share any very notable anecdotes about a relationship between such a child and his or her father?
Can you just repeat that again? I'm sorry. My head
Sure.
was, yeah.
Stephen is asking, would it have been common for a child of an enslaver born to an enslaved woman to know her or his father was their owner? Does that prompt you to share any notable anecdotes about a relationship between such a child and his or her father, who was the enslaver?
Yeah. You know, I would assume that everyone knew, including the child, at some point in their lives. Um, but I don't have any anecdotes. But of course, I have talked to descendants, and these stories, have been passed down within their families. Um, but nothing solid locally uh, that I have that I can pull out, that's been written by that child. Um,
maybe I could add one thing. It's not about a local Arlington person, but
You're talking Thomas Jefferson, is that?
I'm thinking of Geraldine Brooks' book called Horse. There was a lot of attention paid to the relationship between the enslaved, and his enslaver father.
Okay. Yeah, I did read that book. I just, you know, because enslaved people couldn't read and write, they didn't leave a lot of materials written by them.
Mhm.
Um, so, as you could see, like I was getting some of my uh, data from census records that actually don't even have a name. So it's very difficult to get that kind of anecdotal information.
Mhm.
Um, from the things I've read, I imagine that, any child of a white enslaver would, be lighter skinned and would know that they had, a white parent. Um, yeah, and I would assume eventually other enslaved people would tell them the story. But I don't have anything passed down.
Okay. Um, Yolanda has a good question. Doesn't G.W. Parks' will state if enslaved were freed upon his death?
It does, but he gave Robert E. Lee up to 5 years to get his estate in order before freeing the enslaved people. And but Custis had told the people when he was dying, "You're going to be free."
Ah,
So actually, legally, Robert E. Lee was in the right because Custis's estate was in debt, and he needed to have his enslaved people work to pay off the debt, whether or not, I think it's awful, but that is the case. And he had the law on his side in this case. But a lot of the enslaved people were hugely unhappy. Many of them ran away, but ran to DC or, were caught. He ended up hiring out a large number of his enslaved because they simply wouldn't work. Um, they were hugely frustrated by the situation.
thank you. Marion has a comment about pronunciation of the German word,
Yeah.
uh, Stoppelstein. It's Stein is pronounced like an I in English, not Steen. And I,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, so thanks, Marion. Remember,
Thank you, Marian. I actually know that, but for some reason can't seem to say it properly. But thank you. I appreciate that.
okay. Karen says, Great presentation. And first, can we see the recording later on this presentation?" And that is, I can add, Encore Learning has a YouTube channel. So it's usually posted within a day or two after the live presentation. So look for that. And second, where will the play be held on Julia Roberts?
I think it's going to be at the public library.
Oh,
Um, so I don't know the exact date yet, but look for it. It's going to be exciting.
I'm sure the library will publicize that. Karen further has a comment to make. I think it would be nice to have plaques of individuals instead of stones in the ground. I think it is somewhat degrading. They may be ignored and stepped upon. People may not take time to read their names. A plaque on a building or an upright marker is more dignified and fitting for the enslaved.
Yeah, I think that we just have a difference of opinion. I feel like people wouldn't stumble on them if you're out riding your bike or walking to school. If it's a plaque on someone's home, you're not going to go up to the doorway and look at it. Um, and I can't be putting poles in people's lawns with a big sign. That takes a certain level of permitting that is beyond our project. Um, but I do think that there is something extremely powerful about just happening upon the stones, um, and going back in time, imagining the person's story, and then, if you go to our website, you can find more information on that person. So, yeah, it's this decentralized kind of memorial. I think you like it or you don't like it. But it's not made to be stepped on. It's not made to be tripped upon.
It reminds me of the carving in the sidewalks in Falls Church. about the desegregation and segregation of the school system in the Falls Church City area. And you can walk a whole long block and read the story about education in Falls Church on Route 29, actually. Very, very interesting. And they've done a similar thing of carving the history of women in Falls Church on another street. So
Hmm.
there's a complementary sort of memorial of history over there. So Catherine has a question. Isn't there an old brick building from the plantation at National Airport?
Just the foundations. I don't believe that any of the structures from Abington are still around. Perhaps I'm wrong. I have not been over there. I just saw those photos.
Okay. Marion has another comment, a little more information about Stolperstein. It means stumbling stone. The concept is that we stumble across them, notice one underfoot, stop and read it. A similar controversy arose in Germany. The answer was we might just walk past a building and not notice the plaque on it. By the way, each Stolperstein is handmade by one person who installs them as well in Germany.
Yes, it's
Very
amazing.
interesting. And Stephen has another question, a good one. What was the legal argument that Julia Roberts' owners tried to use to counter the probate and will that freed her?
So basically, first of all, they said she was an enslaved person, so sh her testimony shouldn't even be allowed in court, and that was thrown out.
Hmm.
But it's very complicated, but basically Simon Summers, who wrote the deed manumitting Julia's mother, when he wrote the deed, he lived in what was then Fairfax County. But when the deed, when the manumission came, well, actually, 2 months later, he took it down to the courthouse to file the deed. And at that point, it was Alexandria, it was, yeah, Alexandria County, DC that he was living in. So there was a change in jurisdiction, and they used that change to say, well, you know, this he filed the paperwork in the wrong courthouse because he ended up filing in Fairfax County. Um, I think I just confused that. When he went and he filed the paperwork in Fairfax County, but he should have filed the paperwork in Alexandria County, which was a different courthouse. He was at that point unaware that he had to file in a different spot because of this change of jurisdiction. And this was used in the courts, and they said, no, we don't buy that.
Very interesting. That was the last question that's in the Q&A right now, but we have time for more, and feel free to add your questions to Q&A. Any other questions about Encore Learning or any other comments that you want to make? Laura has a couple of announcements to make when we're done, but just to give you one more chance, we certainly have time if you have questions. Jessica, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Now, at the high point, we had 80 people online, so
Oh my goodness,
big
wonderful.
yeah, really nice. Oh, when will the play be held? Karen is asking. Karen, I think it's not been determined yet, but it will be advertised by the Arlington Library.
Yeah, and by memorializing the enslaved.
And okay, and by the project, yes. Right.
I just wanted to add that we have a couple of upcoming classes this semester that are starting next week that people might be interested in. Marty Sadam is teaching a class on Walks with the Rambler, which is visiting historic sites in Arlington. There's information about that on our website. And Bill Fogarty is teaching a course about Arlington in the early 20th century. And he'll be covering many topics that may be of interest to people. Both of those classes start next week, but there's still room in each of them. Marty's class is a walking class starting at different points each week. And the Bill Fogarty's class on 20th century Arlington is a hybrid class. So you can either go to it in person at George Mason or do it virtually or watch the recording. So lots of ways to participate in that. So maybe of interest to folks. And if you're interested in learning more about Encore Learning, there's a QR code. You're welcome to scan that with your phone and check us out.
Laura, there's one more question. May I pose the question to Jessica before
Please.
we go on
Yep.
to the slide? Peg would like to know, when was the first significant collection of these stories? The WPA project in the 1930s? Anything earlier? Thank you.
I think that, their collections, the WPA to me was the first one I knew about. And it's certainly the most comprehensive because it goes state by state. Um, if you look at, newspapers, often they have articles, former enslaved remembers their life, that kind of thing. But yeah, that the WPA guide is the most comprehensive and really the earliest I know of.
Okay, and a follow-up question Karen has, can we read these local stories on your website?
You can.
You
Yeah,
can.
they're all there. If you go under history, it's a drop-down menu. There'll be articles, stories, and a few other options. And all the stories are there.
Excellent. We'll be looking forward to them. All right, Laura.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Look for the recording tomorrow on our YouTube channel. Thank
Thank you.
you.